Um, yeah, I am a reportage illustrator. And what that means is that I draw stories for the news. And I think that's important at the moment, where we live in a world where our attention spans are shorter than ever. And the demand for immediate news keeps growing. How can any of us be expected to fully comprehend any of these issues, nuanced global issues, in the depth that they so badly need? Historically, the realities of the news industry were very different, and papers like the Illustrated London News sent artists around the world desperate for anything visual, paintings and drawings, prints, to accompany the articles printed back in London. And 150 years later, with the immediacy of photography and with enormous budgets driving the news, I guess the question is, for me, what role does such an analog profession as an illustrator with a dip pen and ink have in the news? And indeed, what role do I have? And it's that I'm going to try and talk to you about tonight. I believe that drawing doesn't just see the world, it observes it. And so it was with those thoughts in mind that I set off to West Mosul in 2017. And I want to tell you about 2 or 3 people I met there. It was the height of the sort of last stand of Islamic State. This was the front line of the world against ISIS, propped up by the Iraqi army. And many freelancers like me, photographers and writers and film crews flew to Kurdistan. They got a visa on arrival if they were from Britain. We found fixers, we hired cars, and with a little bit of invention and the right information, headed towards war, which seemed, I suppose, too easy to be able to do at the time, but that was very much the reality of it. Just to describe a little bit more about that access, I often travel with filmmakers or photographers. We're offering different things for the news. And in the morning, we would visit one of the Iraqi generals, General Assadi. He was head of the Golden Division Special Forces in Iraq, and they were charged with clearing the houses, going house to house to clear them from ISIS. And in the morning, we would go and meet him, and he would decide whether we could go with his convoy, where we were going to go, whether access was allowed. And we were very much in their hands as to whether we could get to the front line. And on one particular day, we were taken to, I use the term front line very broadly. It's a kind of moving thing. Nobody ever defines it. But if you're going forwards, you're going to the front, and if you're not, then you're somewhere else. So it was on this particular day that we were taken onto the rooftop, and there's a low wall, and the only instruction, of course, is to keep your head down so that you don't get shot. And if you do that, then you're relatively safe. And in front of me, I can still see it now, there's a general sitting. He hasn't got any flak jacket or helmet on. He's having a cup of tea, and he's sitting under a little tin roof, so the drones can't see him. There's some cameramen taking pictures of these guys firing their guns. And it wasn't totally clear whether they were firing them for the cameras or whether they were actually firing them and the cameras were filming them. And then I'm sitting at the back trying to draw. It's a very mundane, sort of slow process, and I'm wondering whether I fit in at all. And suddenly the general says 30 seconds in English, and I'm wondering why he's saying that. And then he says 15, and the cameramen, local and international, put their cameras on this low wall and they press record, and they count down 3, 2, 1, and this enormous missile crashes into a building a few hundred meters away. And then, the sort of Hollywood plume of smoke comes up, and the camera people press stop, and that was it. We all packed up and went back downstairs again. And I felt a little shortchanged by that. If that was the way that we were recording our news at such distance. And I suppose, apart from anything else, I felt that drawing should be able to offer more, and that my place wasn't necessarily on the front line, but over the next few days in West Mosul, I drew in the bombed out homes and the refugee camps, and watched people still in the hammam, still functioning. And it was this image in particular that stuck in my mind. And I was drawing in a place called Al Thara, and this man came out of his home and saw me sitting on the seat, and he invited me over to his home, and this was it. And as I sat and drew, his taxi caught in the rubble, the chandelier practically still swinging in the kitchen with the walls now missing. He told me of the story, and the Iraqi army had bombed his home, trying to kill 4 Daesh fighters, ISIS fighters that were fighting, and had hidden in his house. Sort of hidden in his house to get away from the fighting, and they bombed it, and at the same time killed his mum, 2 of his brothers, and one of his brother's wives. And it was a month later, March the 17th, I won't forget it, that I sat and he walked around this sort of pathetic scene, trying to sort of gather bits of information from his life. And I suppose this was my way, the time that drawing allowed me was my way of comprehending it. And even now I feel some relief in sharing that story with you, because that was what I promised him and anyone that I've ever drawn to do, and that is to pass on that message. This happened again in Armenia before Christmas, and we become, I think, so used to seeing scenes on our phones immediately flashed up and to disappear on Instagram or any of the other media channels. And I often think that perhaps the process of drawing them is more interesting than the final image. The image is a sort of reminder, but the bits that I remember are the process. And I spent 2 weeks in Armenia at the end of their war with Azerbaijan. It was a time of great national mourning. The Armenian people felt betrayed by their prime minister for giving away their beloved land, disputed but beloved land. And it was a very sensitive place to operate. Many people didn't want to talk. Families were still searching for bodies of loved ones. Often sons and fathers, of course. And this was the last day that we were there. We'd find it incredibly difficult to find people to talk to and to tell their story. But this was the trenches near Martuni, and 2 soldiers, Reuben and Samuel, sitting in the bunker. And it was a site that I thought we had sort of committed to our history books. Sort of shallow dug trenches with those pathetic little trowels that you used to see in war films, helmets lying around, the ground too hard to get things in properly, rubbish everywhere. And underneath the bunker, Samuel and Reuben sat under this plastic sheeting. And it really summed up everything about this war, of our Armenian army, which was incredibly passionate, but without the equipment of its opposition, the Azerbaijanis, backed up by Turkish drones. And of course, there was only one winner. And despite, but I suppose the reason I'm showing you this is because the reportage element of it is only really as good as the people that get to see it. And this war happened at the same time as a second wave of COVID in the UK. And that meant that it was largely forgotten. And so I'm showing you now, but many other the news stories and other parts have still remain unreported. And the people I'm in touch with in Armenia are still trying to put their lives back together. The morgues are still full with unidentified bodies, and people are still looking for homes. So it's difficult to level with, and it makes you feel sort of almost paralyzed, not knowing what to do. This was an image that I guess made more relevant by the recent news in Armenia, but I fell foul of sort of my own set of rules to not expect anything when I'm going to draw. And this is I was allowed 1 day to draw in Gaza by the Israeli authorities. And I was going there expecting to draw the bombed out scenes that we all think of when we think of that little strip of land with so many people living on it. And then in the afternoon, I find this, and it's a sweet family have come out of one of the refugee camps and are sitting on the beach, ordering drinks, playing with their children, watching them swim in the ocean. And even there's a kind of American style lifeguard with a big red flag watching over everybody. And it was an incredibly warm feeling, despite all the things that we've seen. And I guess that was brought back to me recently, just wondering what has happened to them all and whether that can still exist even after the recent wave of violence. The last person I wanted to talk to you about is Khalid, and I guess relevant because it's International Refugee Week this week. Not that anyone who is a refugee will actually know that, but it is important for us who aren't to acknowledge it. And even as I sort of talk about him now, I can feel the sort of hairs on my arms stand up. He'd be 18 this year. Well, he is 18 this year, but he was a refugee. He had witnessed the most horrific trauma and became orphaned when he saw both his parents killed. He fled to Turkey with his sister and lived like so many people do, so many refugees do, especially on those borders, an uncertain life in those camps. And many are still there. These stories didn't end, and the stories of refugees do not end abruptly or conveniently. So I often wonder where he is, and I had also forgotten that the end of his testimony that we took was much more positive than the stories that I had been telling about him. I often start, as I have, by saying that his parents were killed, but actually at the end of his testimony, there's this extraordinary bit from an 11-year-old at the time. And he's talking about the family that he's seen, and he says that I'll just read it to you. I see my family in my dreams all the time, and they are coming to me. And when I grow up, I want to be a policeman and a doctor. I prefer a doctor because I'd like to heal the injured people of the war, but I could also be a policeman, and then I will protect anybody who might come into my home again. And I just remember that as I'm reading it and think that although these stories are incredibly hard to digest, and even some of the ones we've heard tonight are hard to digest, there is in each of them, in Mosul and in Syria and Armenia, a positive human element to them if we can only allow them more time. Drawing has allowed me more time with people like Khalid, and I think strangely during COVID we've been allowed more time. And so I guess the call to action really is to slow down and give people time. It's such a valuable commodity, and so it's with that message that I'd like to sort of leave you thinking about tonight.